Hello, and welcome to Analysis with me, Oliver McTiernan. Peace with Hamas or peace with Israel? You can have one, but not the other. These were the cautionary words of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas earlier today. He was speaking as the first PLO delegation arrived in Gaza for unity talks with their rivals Hamas. These are the latest, but potentially the most significant talks with Hamas, who are considered as a terrorist organisation by Israel and some of the international community. Given the troubled status of the US-brokered peace negotiations between Israel and Palestine, many will be wondering if alternative strategies are being prepared for a possible future of the current talks. With me in the studio today are Sarah Colburn, Director of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Jeff Powell, Campaigns and Policy Director at War on Want, and on the phone we are joined by Danny Ben-Seaman, journalist and former member of the Knesset for the Labour Party, and on Skype we have Fadi Abusidu, UK spokesperson for Fatah. Welcome to you all. But first, let's take a look at this report.
On Tuesday, the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas warned in explicit terms that Israel will have to reassume responsibility for the Palestinian areas if the US-sponsored peace talks finally collapse in a week's time. The warning follows Abbas's request to Israel for a 9-month extension to the peace negotiations. Recent reports suggest that if talks did end by the pre-established deadline on the 29th of April, Abbas could dismantle the Palestinian Authority.
It means if Israel wants to continue its policy and if it will not give the Palestinian Authority its rights, it can bear the responsibilities of this authority. It can take care of the authority. We said this to both the Americans and the Israeli sides.
The comment came as the first group of representatives from the Palestinian Liberation Organization arrived to Gaza for unity talks with their Islamist rivals Hamas, who govern the coastal strip. In response to the talks with Hamas, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said,
"You're coming at an important time. We're trying to relaunch the negotiations with the Palestinians. Every time we get to that point, Abu Mazen stacks on additional conditions which he knows that Israel cannot give. So instead of moving into peace with Israel, he's moving into peace with Hamas. And he has to choose. Does he want peace with Hamas or peace with Israel? You can have one, but not the other."
The peace process was plunged into crisis last month following Israel's refusal to release the last group of prisoners, a move agreed by Israel at the beginning of the latest round of talks.
Israel tried to use the fourth batch of prisoners as political blackmail against the Palestinian Authority, who had promised the Palestinian people that they would be released as part of the peace process. Not releasing them embarrasses the PA, but perhaps the PA have succeeded in front of its people by clarifying that the issue is not in their hands and that the issue is an Israeli blackmail.
With only days left until the deadline expires for the end of the current round of US-sponsored talks, the peace process is now in complete disarray. In this climate, the decisions taken by Mr. Abbas could irreversibly change the region's entire political landscape. Flaminia Giambalvo, Islam Channel.
Dr. Fadi, who's with us on the phone. Dr. Fadi, are the peace talks dead or are they still on the life supports?
The peace talks ongoing behind closed doors, almost at stages. They are being sponsored by the American administration with a key interest in not reaching which in these circumstances, which is a deadlock of talks and negotiation and prospects, and for each party to go and find alternatives for direct negotiations. Now, does that mean they are dead? I don't think so. I think the recent developments on the Palestinian front that with regard to reconciliation and submitting agreements and application for joining conventions as well as the Israeli realization that the Palestinians are sincere and determined not to repeat history again and be bullied, that they will actually take charge and will pursue legal and legitimate routes for realizing their rights. Realizing that, and as well as realizing that the alternative is that they will take responsibility for the occupied territories and for millions of Palestinians for the first time, that will convince them to change and adopt a more practical position.
And we're joined now on the line from Tel Aviv by Danny Ben-Seaman. Danny, what's your take on the present situation of the talks?
The talks about reconciliation are not seen very positively in Israel, and the reactions to this supposedly Fatah-Hamas reconciliation is seen as a sign of breaking up the peace process. So today, the signs are very bad, but otherwise, it doesn't look good. I mean, things are not so well. The Americans are pulling out, and it seems that there is no real will from both sides to go along with this process.
Do you think the talks had actually stalled before these reconciliation talks have taking place in Gaza, the peace process talks?
No, I wouldn't say so. I would say that the Prime Minister, Israeli Prime Minister, has kind of didn't like the idea of releasing the prisoners, or if you want to carry out the agreement with the Palestinian Authority. He thought it would be a heavy political price, and he didn't get exactly what he wanted from Abu Mazen. So it stopped. It stalled much before reconciliation, and this reconciliation comes at a time when both sides are not eager, really, to go together and to try to carry on with the talks.
Jeff, Danny mentioned the issue of the prisoners' release. How important is that from a Palestinian perspective?
Well, we know that there are over 5,000 political prisoners being held in the Israeli detention system. And that includes over 180 people who are held on administrative detention. That means in total secrecy, where evidence is not presented and can be renewed on a 6-month rolling basis. And we know that there are over 200 child prisoners being held in the Israeli detention system as well. So I think these kind of significant numbers and what can be considered gross violations of human rights and violations of the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners should still be a significant point in terms of, for most Palestinians.
The role in the talks, was it more symbolic, the release of the prisoners, or was it more significant than that?
Well, perhaps, Sarah, I don't know if you
Yeah, I think it was far more than just a symbolic issue. 3,000 more Palestinians were arrested during the negotiations, so since the end of June. Israel uses the whole imprisonment detention mechanism to try and control Palestinian legitimate rights. And so if you look at the West Bank, for example, every family will have someone who's either in prison now or who's been in prison. And the prisoners that Israel was refusing to release were prisoners who had been in prison since before the start of the Oslo process. So that's over 20 years.
Danny, is the importance of the prisoner issue understood in Israeli politics and Israeli society?
The prisoners issue has been, if you want, has become more complicated because of the Israeli Arabs among them. The prisoners that we have an Israeli citizenship, and the Palestinian Authority asked to release them. It's a problem in the eyes of many Israelis because they say, what do you care? I mean, talk about the Palestinians. Why do you care about Israeli Arabs? And this issue has become a major problem within the government because one of the major coalition partners has threatened that if they are released, they will leave the coalition, and Mr. Netanyahu will lose his government. So this is the problem with this deal. the Israeli prisoners have become a problem, but otherwise the Palestinian prisoners are a kind of almost a routine in the eyes of the Israelis. It comes and goes. They are released every time they talk with the Palestinians. The problem with 14 Israeli Arabs that are part of the deal.
Part of the deal. Danny, I appreciate you have very limited time with us, so I'd like to ask you, where do you think the talks will go now? Will Kerry manage to get an extension, or do you think they will collapse at the end of this month?
I think that both sides will stick to the talks. Eventually, and Abu Mazen has been talking the last few days to the Israelis, through television, through the print press, and he's saying quite positive things about, I would like to stay, I would like to carry on with the talks, but please help me. And there's not a will in Israel to put an end to this talk. There's a will to continue, and I think on both sides. So I'm optimistic that they will continue the process. As to the peace, can we reach peace at the end of the process? This is a great big question. It's bigger to me, bigger to so many Israelis. So I would say the process will continue. Will we reach peace? That I'm doubtful.
Jeff, you heard Danny stress the importance of the Arab-Israeli prisoners, how significant that issue is in the whole release. Do you think it will remain, the prisoners' release will remain a stumbling block for progress in the talks?
Well, certainly from the Palestinian side, it will remain a critical issue that progress must be made on. Our interest in certainly is raising the international element of this issue. And in that sense, a UK corporation is involved in both the detention facilities within the occupied Palestinian territory and providing services and equipment within Israeli prisons where, as I say, these over 5,000 Palestinian prisoners are being held. So we're trying to raise awareness that G4S, a British company, is actually playing a key role in keeping this system alive.
Fadi, you heard Danny's remarks about the talks will continue, but if I'm interpreting him right, he wasn't too optimistic that there'll be a successful outcome. What's your position as official Fatah spokesperson on this?
I have to say that there are no surprises in the current situation at all. We've made our position very clear to the Americans and the Israelis many months ago about what will happen when the 9 months of negotiation ends in April. And we've made our position very clear regarding the reconciliation with Hamas for a long time, many years now, that it is a strategic interest of the Palestinian politics of Fatah and the Palestinian Liberation Organization that Palestinian reconciliation is achieved. And the reconciliation have been supported by the Arab countries in the form of sponsorship from Egypt, Qatar, agreements were reached. There are no secrets whatsoever about what was achieved today and yesterday in the talks in Gaza. And there are no surprises with regard to Palestinians going to submit accession applications to international agreements. And there are no surprises that the Palestinians are not willing to continue talk for the sake of talk with the Israelis. There are no surprises. The only difference is that the Israelis for the first time realized that it is the moment of truth and that the Palestinians are not going to step down or pull back this time, and that the Israelis need to confront their responsibilities as an occupier, and they need to take hard decisions if they want to reach peace. With regard to the prisoners issue, since the Israeli occupation began, more than 800,000 Palestinians been in and out of Israeli prisons. But that's not the focal point, and the identity or citizenship of the prisoners is not the focal point as well. But we cannot continue negotiating what we negotiated on to begin with. The release of the prisoners, the fourth group of prisoners, was negotiated on as part of the agreement to enter into negotiations last year. We cannot renegotiate what we agreed on. It just does not work.
I think that Fadi is completely right on that point, and I would like to go back to a point that he made earlier about Palestinians using legal and legitimate means to try and advocate for their own rights. And the interesting thing is that is completely 180 degrees opposite to the way that the Israelis are approaching these negotiations, because what they are doing, rather than legal and legitimate means, they're looking at increasing their illegality and the illegitimacy of their actions. And so, for example, just in this 9-month period, they have started construction or started developing another 10,500 illegal settlements in the West Bank. And so I think that Fadi's initial statement and what he's just said clarifies what is going on. There is an occupier and an occupied. You cannot pretend that you're dealing with two different states, which is how the peace process is often presented. What you are dealing with is an occupier and an occupied. And you are dealing with some very, very brutal and horrific violations of international law that are carried out daily by Israel. And unless a peace process actually deals with those violations of international law, respects Palestinian rights, it is bound to flounder. That's the reason why we've been here time and time again.
From what you say, Sarah, do you think a two-state solution is still a viable option?
Well, I think, again, that it's always been in Israel's hands to be able to deliver, and it's Israel that has made a two-state solution less and less viable.
And the international community, what role?
Well, I think that it's been shameful that the international community, the UN, governments such as our own, have not been stronger in taking sanctions and taking actions against Israel to force Israel to abide by international law. So on the one hand, they're saying, yes, we support a two-state solution, but on the other hand, they're not doing anything to stop companies like, for example, G4S and other companies that profit from Israel's illegal occupation, its settlements and its wall, from doing business inside Israel. And so I think that there is a real urgency for action, solidarity actions internationally, to put pressure on governments, including our own, and the UN, which, after all, a combination of our government and the UN are responsible in a very great degree for what's happening at the moment. And the onus is on us to get those bodies, our governments and the UN, to actually act to support Palestinian rights and to uphold international law.
Jeff, what is your organisation doing to bring this case, the case of the prisoners, to the international bodies like the UN, EU?
War on Want is a supporter of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. Now, on April 17th, 2012, Palestinian hunger strikers called for a boycott of G4S as a major international corporation that is supporting the occupation. They provide, as I was saying, services and equipment both to prisons on the Israeli side, but also to detention centers where human rights organizations have documented torture conditions, not only of political prisoners, but of children as well. So we're trying to raise UK citizens' awareness of that, and we're calling for various bodies to divest from G4S. So that's been very successful, that call so far, in terms of getting pension funds across Europe, councils and various public bodies to also cancel service contracts that they hold with G4S. Universities, student unions have done the same kind of thing. So we've been successful in getting millions of pounds of contracts cancelled.
G4S would challenge and saying that what they're doing isn't in breach of any international law.
Well, we would argue that that's an incorrect interpretation.
Yeah,
they have recognized themselves that their services that they provide in the occupied Palestinian territories are essentially illegal, and they're ending those contracts, though we want to keep the pressure on them to really do what they say they're going to do. They have refused to say that what they're doing in the Israeli prison system is itself also a contribution to breaking the Geneva Convention.
Thanks, Jeff. Fadi, unfortunately, Danny Ben-Seaman had to leave us. He had a very limited time. But I just being at a conference today where the Israeli participants feel that the international community is not an honest broker towards them, that there's a bias, a prejudice, and they'll quote the boycotts and the various campaigns. And then the Palestinian participants, businessmen at this conference, were saying, well, the international community is no longer an honest broker. Where do we stand in this? How do you perceive things?
Well, I think it is worth mentioning that there is an old Israeli saying, meet two Israelis, you hear three opinions. So I think that different groups will have within the Israeli political spectrum, within the Jewish communities, either in the US, the UK, or elsewhere, will have different viewpoints on this issue. Whether the international community is biased towards Israel, neutral, or actually unfair to Israel. I don't think that many Israelis can argue that the international community nowadays is treating Israel unfairly. I mean, the accession with the EU, trade agreements with the US, unconditional access to military weapons and military markets in the US, Israel being the only country standing outside international parameters of international law and international conventions with regard to nuclear weapons, for example, with no consequence whatsoever and no pressure to join. I don't think that these are indications that we can disregard when assessing the international community's viewpoint or approach to Israel.
Do you think, Jeff, we're almost out of time, so very, very shortly, as you're going to leave us in this session, do you think the boycott movements, the campaigns, are having an impact on Israeli policies?
I think they're having a huge impact. I think it's really given a vitality to the global campaign to raise awareness around really what's going on in the negotiations. It's very successful in terms of hitting these companies where it hurts, in the checkbook, and now going after groups like the Gates Foundation, which is heavily invested in G4S, which is for its involvement in the prisons in the occupied Palestinian territories. It's raising awareness at just how far these tentacles reach and how much still needs to be done to really put the pressure onto Israel.
Do join us again after the break.